May 5th, 1945. The European war was making its last gasping breaths. William Cooper, the staff sergeant, was at the boundary of Wageningen. He was a hardened soldier. It seemed to him that he had grasped 150 faces of misery that the war might draw. However, when his unit entered the town, the engines of their jeeps and tanks slashing through the unbelievable silence, Cooper saw that he was mistaken. They were looking forward to roaring crowds. They were hoping to see flags waving at the windows, women kissing the soldiers, and men giving out bottles of saved wine. That was what they had perceived in Paris and Brussels as liberation. But the air was oppressive, sultry, and silent here. The individuals who came out of the brick houses did not run, but shuffled. They were fair, their skin clear and lean over cheekbones that stuck out. They were not so much like a welcoming committee as they were like ghosts roaming in a graveyard. It is not merely a narrative of the World War II coming to an end. It is a legend of how food was weaponized, how desperate people can be, how even a chocolate bar became a source of salvation of the nation that was on the verge of extinction. In the sea of gray faces, Cooper saw the eyes of a little face looking near a lamppost. It was a small girl, about 7 years old, but her retarded development caused her to look much younger. She was drowning in a worn floral dress which had definitely been an elder sister or a mother, and was now sewed and patched until it was made of more thread than cloth. The dress was loose around her shoulders, and she had collarbones exposing the appearance of delicate wings of a bird. She didn't ask for anything. She didn't hold out her hand. She just stood and looked up at the American soldier with the eyes that looked too big to her withered face. It was the 1,000-yard stare, which one normally encounters in battle veterans, but this time on the face of a first grader. Cooper could feel a swelling in his throat. He slipped into his webbing and unzipped a typical Hershey tropical chocolate bar without saying a word. And it was a block of chocolate, hard and dense, and calculated not to melt in the heat, but it was a ration to a soldier. He dropped down, bringing himself by his eye level to hers, and reached out to her. The girl didn't move at first. She stared at the brown bar, and then at the face of Cooper, and then again at the bar. In her world, a world of gray ash and frozen watercolor and sweetness no longer existed. She outstretched her trembling hand, and her fingers resembled twigs, and grabbed it. She didn't tear it open. She didn't eat it immediately. She took it to her nose and sniffed. Her smell of cocoa and sugar appeared to rock her back physically. Her lips shaken, and without utterance, tears flowed down her eyes. They were not the weeping sobs of a tantrum. They were the sobs of a soul that had lost all idea of what benevolence was. Cooper stood and watched her embrace the chocolate to her breasts with both hands, like it were a jewel. She could see more children start fading out of the shadows of the alleyways behind her. They silently came with the appearance of the soldier. They were a heartbreaking parade of shreddy clothes and sunken eyes. Others were so feeble that they bent on the walls. They were the descendants of the Hongerwinter, and they were dying to starvation in the middle of the 20th century. We must go back to know why this little girl was standing there, shaking over a piece of chocolate. We must learn the blackness which had settled down upon the Netherlands. Starvation of the Netherlands was not a coincidence. It was not a drought crop failure or a blight crop failure. It was a crime. It was an act of mass punishment, calculated and planned by Nazi forces of occupation. In September 1944, the Allies went on a huge airborne attack Operation Market Garden, which was meant to complete the war by Christmas. The Dutch government in exile in London requested a national railway strike to help in this liberation fight. The gallant Dutch railroaders halted the trains in the hope that they would handicap the German troop and supply transportation. But the operation failed. Arnhem was a halt to the Allies. The Netherlands was still in the Nazi boots. Enraged by the Dutch resistance, the German Reichskommissar Arthur Seyss-Inquart appended his signature to an order which was to destroy thousands. He also blocked all food and fuel shipment to the Western Netherlands. This region of the country, comprising of major cities such as Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and The Hague, was virtually isolated off the agricultural core. Then, nature rebelled against them. The winter of 1944 to 1945 was marked in the history as one of the most severe in decades. The arteries of Dutch transport, the canals, had frozen. The cold came down and remained. By November, the coal ran out. Electricity and gas were turned off. The Dutch houses, which were generally cozy and friendly, became cold graves. Families in the houses crowded together with all the blankets they had and tended to sleep together so as to share body warmth. The Dutch people had no fuel to warm their houses or even prepare their meals, and thus they had to cannibalize themselves. They burned their furniture. They tore down the floorboards of their living rooms. They cut down the nice trees which were in the streets of their cities. There was not a single tree standing in the Amsterdam parks. Even blocks of wood between the tram rails were lifted up and burnt, and then the food ran out. The meal allowance was reduced to 1,000 calories, then 800, then 500. In February 1945, the official ration had reduced to 340 calories a day. In context, one average bagel contains approximately 300 calories. And that was all a man or woman of grown age had to live on at 24 hours of freezing cold. It was strange how the cities were silent. No cars, no trams, and very few people. Vitality was too valuable to be spent on walking. People spent 20 hours a day in bed, attempting to decelerate their metabolisms, glaring at the ceiling, hoping that a liberation would arrive, which apparently never would. Hunger is a shapeshifter. Initially, it was a stomach ache. Then, it makes it an obsession of the mind. At last, it turns into a lunacy that subdues all the instincts, except that of survival. Since the bread and potatoes were disappearing, the Dutch people were forced to resort to food that was not intended to be consumed by humans. The tulip bulb is the best representative of this period. The Netherlands was known to be a land of flowers, which were now turned to a land of survival. The desperate families would mill the tulip bulbs into a pulp to create a watery soup or a hard bread full of sawdust. But tulip bulbs are not food. They are hard, fibrous, and so bitter. Unless properly prepared, they are not very toxic, but rashes and stomach pain will result. But in 1945, a bowl of tulip soup, gray, bitter, was a feast. The doctors put recipes in the newspapers on how to cook them to reduce the poison, and mothers were called on to peel the skin on its back in order to save the stomach of their children. They also consumed tough sugar beets that livestock typically feed on. They were gross and gaggingly sweet, but they gave strength. But to most people, even the tulips had died. The tragic phenomenon was the hunger marches, or Hongerthocht, which was born with this desperation. This was the most graphic picture of the famine. Thousands of women would walk with their feet wrapped. They would march out of the starving cities and march into the countryside, walking 20, 30, 40 kilometers at times in the frozen snow. They were pushing prams or pulling sleds, but not with a baby, with the wealth of their family. They brought silver spoons, wedding rings, old clocks, and good linens. They visited the distant farms that had not yet been completely plundered by the Germans and asked the farmers to give a sack of potatoes in exchange with a gold ring. They would take days of walking, hungry, and sleep in barns or ditches. Many never made it back. They were discovered lying by the side of the road, so stiff with frozen bodies, holding to their hands a little bag of grain they had died in attempting to carry home to their children. The Hongerwinter had increased physical pain, but the psychological pain of parents was a torture on its own. Think yourself to be a mother at Amsterdam in January 1945. You have 3 children, 1 piece of stale bread and a pot of thin beet soup. You look at your children. The young one has ceased crying since he is too weak to make a sound anymore. The eldest is gazing ferociously at the bread. You have to make a choice. Who receives the slightly bigger slice? Who is the most in need of it to live through the night? Do you nourish the most ill in perspective of saving life? Or do you nourish him who is mightiest to make at least one of you survive? People have heard about using leather belts as broth boiled by the family in hope that some protein remained in the animal hide. Darker whispers, which are seldom mentioned to the outer world, of the family pets being taken away to the stew pots, not out of cruelty, but out of a frenzied, savage necessity to keep a child alive one more day. This was the Sophie's choice, filled in thousands of households each and every night, 6 months in a row. The pain of accounting survival. I give him this potato, he lives. If I don't, he dies. Towards the beginning of 1945, the social fabric was shredding. Stunningly, though, in the middle of the horror, there was love. It is a miracle that so many children survived, an achievement owed to the superhuman sacrifice of their parents, who literally sacrificed the flesh off their backs and faded away so that the next generation might see the spring. By April 1945, it was an apocalypse situation. The death rate of the Dutch had shot through the roof. 20,000 individuals had lost their lives through starvation. The Allied commanders had been informed that there would be none left to liberate should they not act prior to the signing of the surrender by the Germans. Thus, they set out on a mission such as none other in the war. The British called it Operation Manna, and the Americans referred to it as Operation Chowhound. Over the years, the rattle of deep thrumming roar of Lancaster and B-17 engines meant terror. It was explosions, fire, and death. On April 29, 1945, however, the Dutch people could hear the scream once again. Then they gazed up in terror at the last stroke. The aircraft were flying way too low to the extent that people were able to see the rivets on the wings. They flew in between the roofs of Rotterdam and The Hague, and the bomb bay doors did not open out to drop high explosives. Rather, the sky with parachutes and crates, flour bags, packages of powdered dried eggs, tins of Spam, chocolate, and margarine fell in the heavens. These were emotional missions to the pilots. Most of these airmen had been destroying cities over a long period of time. Now, they were saving them. The fields below have been reported to be covered with people waving by the pilots. The Dutch had planted the tea tulips in great letters as you could see them fly along in the air. Thanks, boys, and many thanks. One of the American gunners wrote back to his family after witnessing women fleeing to the fields, falling down to the ground and holding the food sacks. I had to cry so much that I could not see my instruments. It was the initial occasion of the war when I got the feeling that I was engaged in something that was purely good. These food litterings did not immediately end the famine, but they clogged the mental strangulation of the blockade. They were an assurance of heaven. Hold on. We are here. You haven't been forgotten. The bombers were delivering food by air, and as the ground forces such as Sergeant Cooper were coming in on the east. It was a collision of two different worlds when the liberation finally came in May. The American and the Canadian soldiers were young, fit, tan, and arguably one of the best-fed armies of all history. They were carrying cigarettes, gum, and K-rations in their pockets, and against them were the Dutch, gray, skeletal, lice-covered, sore. And the reunion was tumultuous and touching. Soldiers would get out of their tanks and be swarming. But not as in France, where the troops were unruly. Here the soldiers were frequently reduced to be nanny men in a few minutes after landing. Veterans remember the amazement of picking up a Dutch child and having no sense of weight, such as holding a bird. They can remember the odor of soiled bodies and illness that lingered over the cities. The soldiers did not wait long before they defied a procedure. They were to ration themselves, and it became the human in it. They disinfected their rucksacks. Here, accept this, a soldier would say, and give him a tin of meat. Take it all. But there was a latent danger in this amiability. The doctors were forced to issue wild commands soon. Feed them not hugely. The soldiers discovered the truth of the so-called Refeeding Syndrome. When a starving individual consumes excessive fats or sugar too fast, his or her metabolism fails and death can be caused by a heart failure. It was an inhuman irony that the chocolate bar or the can of Spam presented out of love would killing the recipient. Soldiers were forced to learn how to be gentle. They were forced to grind biscuits in warm water to form a paste. They were forced to feed the children one spoon at a time and not giving in to the cries of the children who were desperate to get more. It demanded a hard science than fighting. As a soldier, it was a paradox that broke many hearts because it was so painful accepting that a starving child was not to have a full meal or else he would die. It was a slow, agonizing process to recover the Netherlands. The liberation did not stop the suffering in one day. Temporary hospitals were established in churches, schools, and empty warehouses. The doctors of the army labored together with Dutch nurses. Patients they treated were skeletons, living people whose bodies ate themselves. But it was more than the medical crisis. There was the crisis of the spirit. The children of the Netherlands had lost the art of playing. They had lost their ability to laugh. 5 years they had lived in a world of whispers, hiding, and fear. Here, the American GI was at his very best. The soldiers took the position of surrogate fathers and big brothers. During the weeks of the liberation, as they awaited their orders to take the home shipment, the troops took over neighborhoods. They did not only come with food, they came with culture. They held baseball matches in the streets with the rubble and used sticks as bats and rocks as bases. They gave the Dutch children English slang. They exposed them to jazz music and comic books. One finds thousands of photographs of this period of harsh, battle-worn soldiers seated on the curbs, demonstrating to a fascinated Dutch boy how to blow a bubble with chewing gum. Such were not insignificant moments. They were therapy. Through their interaction with the kids, by giving them affection and protection, the soldiers brought back the childhoods that the Nazi had attempted to erase. They demonstrated to these kids that uniformed men did not necessarily mean death. There were instances when they bore fun. One of the Dutch survivors commented many years later, "It is the food that kept us alive, but the soldiers made us willing to live once again." The relationship that was developed during that starving spring brought about a relationship between the Netherlands and the United States that is the only one in the world. It was not merely political friendship, but blood friendship. The Dutch people never forgot. Margraten is a venue in the southern Netherlands. It is the American military cemetery, where nearly 8,000 American soldiers are buried, boys who lost their lives to break the blockade and open the roads so that the food trucks can go through. Even now, all the graves in that cemetery are adopted by a Dutch family. The grave is in a waiting list of families who desire to adopt a grave. Grandmothers have been visiting these graves on Sundays with grandchildren. They bring flowers. The white marble crosses are washed by them. They inform the children that this man died so we could eat bread. The practice is more than 75 years old. It is possibly the greatest act of thank you note ever. Even the soldiers had been transformed. A lot of GI went back to America and could not forget the little girl with the chocolate bar or the boy who taught them Dutch words. They were in touch via thousands of them who continued to send care packages to their adopted Dutch families many years after the war and helped them rebuild their lives and their homes. It is easy to gauge the success of a war through the treaties signed or the redrawing of the borders. Yet the real sign of victory in 1945 was in the silent times, the bite of a fresh loaf of bread, the coziness of a coal fire, the recovery of a child laughter. The Dutch Hongerwinter is a sharp look at how brutal people can be at times, how they can use hunger as a weapon against the innocent. However, it is simultaneously a statement about the contrary, the incredible ability to be compassionate. If this story of resilience and humanity moved you, please honor the history by liking this video and sharing it with others. Let's ensure the sacrifices of the past are never forgotten. Subscribe for more stories from the front lines of history, and I'll see you in the next video.